She arrived in the town as a bride who had already been rejected before she was even given the chance to become one. The wagon stopped with a slow, tired creak at the edge of the platform. A few passengers stepped down, collecting their bags and moving away into the cold air. She was the last one left inside. When she finally stepped down, it was not with hesitation, but with the careful control of someone who had already decided that whatever happened next would not be shown on her face. She carried a single small bag. Her dress was plain, worn from the journey, and no longer held the shape it once had when she left the agency office. The wind touched her skin, but she did not react. Her hands stayed loose at her sides. Her chin remained level. At the far end of the platform, the man who had arranged the marriage stood, waiting. He did not move toward her. Not at first. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to confirm is real and regretting that it is. When she reached a point where they could no longer avoid each other, he spoke. His voice carried farther than it needed to. "I can't do this," he said. The words were simple, but the way he said them made them heavier. There was no quiet conversation between them, no attempt at privacy. He had chosen distance on purpose. A few heads turned. The platform was not empty. People were arriving, leaving, passing through, and now they were all aware. "I thought you'd be better," he added, almost as if explaining himself to the air rather than to her. The sentence hung there longer than the sound of his voice. She did not respond. She did not ask what he meant. She did not ask why he had sent for her in the first place if he had expectations he never expressed. She simply stood still, holding her bag a little tighter now, as though anchoring herself to something invisible beneath her feet. Then he raised the folded papers in his hand. The contract, the agreement that had brought her here. He did not throw them. He did not tear them. He only lifted them slightly, as if to remind both of them, and everyone watching, that this situation had been written down somewhere and therefore could be justified. But everyone there also knew something unspoken. A woman was not property, and paper did not turn hesitation into ownership. Still, the gesture did its damage. It made her feel for a moment like something placed and then removed. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One man looked away. Another watched too long, and then the man who had called her there stepped back, not slowly, not thoughtfully, just enough to create distance between them. "That's it," he said, as if ending something that had already been decided without her. He turned, tucked the papers into his coat, and walked away without looking back. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly against the wooden platform. For a moment, no one moved. She remained where she was, standing alone with her bag at her feet, as if the space around her had forgotten what to do with her presence. The town stretched beyond the station. Buildings, smoke, distant movement, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything had changed in a single public moment that no one would later need to explain. She understood something then, clearly and without emotion. She had not simply been refused a marriage. She had been placed in the open and then left, there for others to interpret, and that was when she heard footsteps approaching from across the street. She did not move. Immediately, after the man walked away, the platform did not return to normal. It stayed slightly suspended, as if the air itself was unsure whether the moment had fully ended. People continued to pass through, but slower now, more aware, like they had accidentally stepped into something private that was not meant to be private at all. She stood in the same place, her bag still at her feet. Not because she was waiting for anything in particular, but because she had learned, long before this moment, that movement made emotion harder to control. Stillness, on the other hand, allowed her to think. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware store holding a paper bag of metal fittings. He paused at the edge of the boardwalk steps. He was not a man dressed for attention. His sleeves were marked with sawdust. His posture carried the tiredness of physical work, the kind that settles into a body and does not leave easily. He looked like someone who measured things in usefulness. Not appearance, but he was watching the platform, watching her. Not in the way the others were watching, out of curiosity or discomfort, but in a quieter, more deliberate way. As if he was trying to understand what had just happened without asking anyone to explain it. He saw the empty space where the man had stood. He saw the bag at her feet. He saw the way she did not collapse into herself even though she had every reason to. Then he crossed the street. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just directly. The sound of his boots on the wooden steps was steady, unhurried. He stopped at the bottom of the platform and looked up at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said his name. Seth Callan. It was not said like an introduction meant to impress. It was said like a fact that had no emotional weight attached to it. "I've got 2 children," he continued, "and a house that needs keeping." He did not soften the words. He did not frame them as kindness. He framed them as reality. "I work carpentry 3 days a week," he said. "So mornings you'd have the place to yourself." She studied him while he spoke. Not his face alone, but the way he held himself. There was no urgency in him. No attempt to fill silence. No effort to correct what had just happened on the platform. Just structure, practicality, function. "It's temporary," he added after a moment. "Room and board until you figure out what comes next." The word temporary mattered. It made the offer feel honest. Not like rescue. Not like ownership. Just space. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she took a small breath and looked past him for a moment, toward the street behind, where life continued without stopping for her situation. Then she looked back at him. "Can you cook?" she asked. The question did not match the situation, which was exactly why it worked. It shifted the power of the moment, away from pity and back into practicality. A faint pause passed between them. He almost seemed to consider it seriously. "No," he said, "that was all." She nodded once. "Can," she replied, and then she picked up her bag. "Then let's go," she said. There was no hesitation in her voice, no gratitude spoken out loud, no emotional negotiation, just agreement based on usefulness and need. They walked off the platform together. Behind them, the town did not react loudly. It did not need to. Instead, it stored the moment quietly, the way small towns store everything that will be discussed later in kitchens, at fences and in half-closed doors. And as she stepped into a life she had not been promised but had chosen anyway, something subtle shifted inside her understanding of what survival looked like. It was not about being wanted. It was about being able to move forward when no one was required to offer her a way. Inside the house, the air felt different from the platform. Not warmer exactly, but contained, as if the walls understood their job and did not interfere with anything happening inside them. The cabin stood at the edge of town, close enough to be practical, far enough to feel separate from judgment. He let her in without ceremony. The front room was simple, clean in the way a space becomes when it has been maintained by necessity rather than decoration. A workbench sat against one wall. A stove stood in the corner, steady and functional. Nothing in the room suggested softness, but nothing suggested neglect either. It was a house built around survival, not comfort. "This is it," he said, as if there was no need to explain further. He pointed to a narrow room off the kitchen. "That's yours." No embellishment. No apology, just assignment of space. She stepped inside the house and took in everything at once. Not emotionally, but observantly. The placement of objects, the lack of disorder, the way certain things had been left untouched for too long, not because they were unimportant, but because no one had claimed responsibility for them. On a shelf above the kitchen window, she noticed a small sewing basket. It had a wooden lid, slightly worn, unmoved for a long time. Something about it suggested absence more than use, but she said nothing. A boy appeared first. Not loudly, not dramatically, just at the edge of awareness, like someone who had been listening before deciding to be seen. He was about 10 years old. His posture already carried imitation of adulthood, but his eyes still held suspicion. He looked at her, then at his father, then back again. He did not speak. He simply observed. Then he turned and walked away. A few seconds later, a girl appeared, younger, unfiltered. She stood in the doorway with full attention, as if nothing in her world had yet taught her to hide curiosity. She looked directly at Willa. "Are you staying?" she asked. Willa looked back at her. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. The girl considered this, then nodded as if it made sense. "Okay," she said, and walked closer. That was how she entered the house, not through permission, but through acceptance that had not yet been complicated by fear. Supper came without conversation about what the arrangement meant. Beans, bread, a simple broth. Nothing impressive, but the smell filled the space in a way that changed how the house felt. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those living inside it. The man sat at the table. The children ate quietly, watching more than speaking. Halfway through the meal, the girl spoke. "The last woman burned everything," she said. No accusation, just memory. The man did not respond. Willa did not look up immediately. She continued eating as if the information had weight but not urgency. "Burnt food happens," she said calmly after a moment. "It usually means someone was tired, not careless. That was all. No defense of the previous woman. No correction of the child. Just interpretation." The boy glanced up briefly, then returned to his plate. But something in his expression shifted slightly, like a calculation had been interrupted. After dinner, no one asked her what she would do tomorrow. No one defined her role, and that absence of definition created something unusual in the room. Space for observation without expectation. Later that night, she washed the dishes while the man sat nearby at the table. He was not reading, not speaking, just present in a way that suggested he was used to thinking while others worked. At one point, he asked without looking up, "You all right?" She paused slightly, considering the question not emotionally but practically. "Yes," she said. That was enough for him. He nodded once and returned to silence, and the house settled into its first shared quiet. Not comfortable yet, but stable, and stability in a place like that was the beginning of everything that mattered. The days did not change quickly. They did not need to. Instead, they arranged themselves quietly into patterns that no one announced but everyone began to follow. Willa woke before the house. She learned the rhythm of the stove first, then the water, then the sound the floor made when it was still too early for anyone else to be awake. The house had its own language, and she learned it without asking permission. The man, Seth, watched without interfering. Not because he was distant, but because he understood something practical. People either fit into a system or they do not, and forcing it rarely improved anything. The children watched differently. The boy, Jack, tested everything without calling it testing. One morning, he simply did not do what she asked. She had told him to bring in the wood. He did not move. He leaned back slightly, waiting, like he wanted to see what kind of adult she would become under pressure. Willa appeared in the doorway a moment later. "Jack," she said evenly. "The wood," he shrugged. "I was going to." "I know," she replied. "Do it now." There was no anger in her voice. No negotiation. No repetition, just finality. That was new. He studied her for a second longer, as if trying to find where the weakness was supposed to be. Then he stood up and did it. No argument. No complaint. Just action. From the workbench, Seth had heard everything. He did not intervene, but he also did not ignore it. He simply set his tools down for a moment and stayed still, as if registering a shift in structure that required no correction. After that, the house began to adjust itself, not dramatically, but in small permissions. Jack started staying at the table longer after meals, not leaving immediately as he used to. Sometimes he carved small pieces of wood, pretending not to listen, but listening anyway. The girl, Mary, followed Willa more openly now, not cautiously but with growing trust, as if she had quietly decided that this woman was not temporary in the way others had been. She asked questions without hesitation. "What are you doing? Can I help? Will you show me?" And Willa answered all of them the same way she did everything else, simply, directly, without over-explanation. Seth began coming home at the same time each evening without thinking about it. It was not a decision he announced to himself. It just became the hour when the house felt complete enough to return to. One evening, Willa read a story to Mary at the table. She did not change her voice dramatically. She did not perform it, but she gave each character enough difference that the child followed without effort. Mary leaned into her side without noticing. She was doing it. Seth stood in the doorway for a moment and watched, not interrupting, not commenting, just observing, something forming that did not require his control. Later that night, Jack remained at the table after everyone else had moved away. He did not speak. He just stayed. That alone was a change. The house did not become warm overnight, but it became consistent, and consistency is what children recognize before they recognize love. By the end of that week, even the smallest routines had shifted. The cups were placed differently. The fire was tended earlier. The silence between people was no longer uncertain. It was shared. And in that shared silence, something began to take shape that none of them named yet, but all of them had started to rely on. A life that did not need explaining to exist. It happened on a morning that looked like every other morning. Nothing in the sky suggested it would matter. The house was already awake in pieces. The stove was lit. The air was still cold enough to keep everyone moving a little faster than usual. Willa was in the kitchen. Seth had already gone out and come back in, boots dusted with frost. Jack was near the table. Mary was somewhere between sleep and activity, drifting through the rooms the way children do when they are still half dreaming. And then, in a single moment that did not announce itself, everything shifted. Mary slipped. It was small at first, just a step that didn't land right between the kitchen and the hall. Her foot caught. Her balance broke, and she went down hard on both hands. The sound was not dramatic, but it was real enough that the house registered it instantly. For half a second, there was silence. Then Mary cried, not immediately in full force, but in that startled way children cry when their body reacts before their mind has decided how serious the moment is. Willa was there. Before the sound fully formed, she did not hurry in a panic. She simply arrived quickly, as if she had already decided that this was what she would do if it ever happened. She dropped to her knees beside the girl. "Show me," she said softly. Mary held out her hands. The palms were scraped, not deeply but enough to sting, enough to feel unfair in the moment it happened. Willa took both of the small hands in hers. She did not exaggerate the injury. She did not dismiss it either. She just held them carefully. Steadying. "It's going to be fine," she said calmly. "It just hurts right now." Mary's breathing wavered, and then, without thinking, without planning, without understanding fully what she was saying, she whispered the word into the space between them. "Mama." The house did not react loudly, but it changed. Not physically, not visibly, but something in the atmosphere tightened and softened at the same time, like a thread pulled into place. Willa did not answer immediately. Her hands stayed where they were, still holding, still steady. For a brief moment, she simply looked at the child, as if waiting to see if the word would disappear on its own. It did not. Mary leaned closer instead, trusting the contact more than the meaning. Willa finally pulled her in, not sharply, not emotionally overwhelmed, but completely. She held her the way someone holds something they did not expect to be given, but now cannot set down without breaking something important. From the doorway, Seth saw it. He did not step forward. He did not interrupt. But he also did not move away. He stood there, one hand resting against the frame, watching the moment land fully in the house. Something inside him tightened. Not in resistance, but in recognition, because he understood what had just happened. A child had not just spoken a word. She had assigned belonging, and belonging, once spoken in a house like this, did not stay private. Jack had stopped moving entirely. He was watching, but not like before. This was different. There was no testing in his eyes now, only understanding forming slowly, reluctantly, like something he had avoided naming for a long time. Willa kept holding Mary until the crying softened, not because she told it to stop, but because it ran its course inside safety. Eventually, Mary's breathing slowed, her grip loosened, slightly, and she stayed. There, still close, still held. Willa did not correct the word. She did not acknowledge it out loud. She simply stayed where she was, because some things, once spoken, do not need permission to remain true. Seth eventually stepped back into the hallway, not leaving the moment behind, but giving it space to exist without being observed too closely. Later, when he sat alone for a moment, he did not think in words. He simply understood something quietly. The house had changed categories. It was no longer only a place where people stayed. It was becoming a place where people belonged. And that change could not be reversed by silence anymore. It did not come in a dramatic way. There was no warning that something final was about to happen. It came instead like most important moments do. Quietly, inside an ordinary morning that had no reason to be remembered. The air was cold enough that breath still showed. The house was already moving in its usual rhythm. Stove first, water second. Wood. Routine. The kind of order that only exists when people have learned each other well enough not to interfere. Willa was at the kitchen table, mending something without urgency. Seth came down the stairs differently that morning. Not louder, not faster, just different in weight. Willa noticed before she looked up. Jack noticed too, though he did not say anything. Mary was still half asleep near the stove, holding on to warmth more than awareness. Seth stopped near the table. He didn't sit immediately. That was the first sign something had changed. He poured his coffee, but he did not drink it right away. He stood there for a moment, as if organizing something inside himself that could not be said, casually. Then he sat down across from her, not at the edge of the table like before. Directly across, the space between them felt deliberate now. Willa kept her hands moving for a few seconds longer than necessary, not out of avoidance but out of patience. She understood that when a person arrives at a decision like this, interrupting it can break the clarity of it. Seth folded his hands on the table. He looked down at them first, then up at her. "I've been thinking," he said. His voice was steady, but quieter than usual. That alone made the room feel different. Willa did not respond. She simply waited. Seth continued. "This arrangement can't stay what it is." A pause. Jack looked up slightly, then stopped moving altogether. Mary did not fully understand, but she felt the change and became still. Seth exhaled once, then said it plainly. "I want you to stay here permanently." The words landed without decoration. No persuasion, no emotional pressure, just decision. Another pause followed. Then he added, more carefully as if naming something that required respect. "As my wife. If that's what you want." The room became very still. Even the stove seemed quieter for a moment. Willa stopped her hands. Not suddenly, but completely. She looked at him. Not quickly, not emotionally, but fully. As if she was not reacting to the words alone, but to everything that had led to them. The house, the routines, the children, the silence they had shared, the way nothing had ever been forced, but everything had still changed. She stood up, slowly, not leaving the moment, entering it. She walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking outside, not because she was unsure, but because she was allowing herself the time to answer something that mattered. Behind her, Seth did not speak again. He waited. Jack watched. Mary stayed still, sensing that whatever was happening did not require interruption. Willa turned back. She walked to the table, and instead of sitting, she stood beside him. She did not ask for repetition. She did not negotiate the meaning. She simply extended her hand open, not hesitant, not demanding, just offered. Seth looked at it. Then he took it in both of his. That was the only answer he needed before she spoke. "Yes," she said quietly. Not as a reaction, as a decision that had already been forming long before the question was asked. The house did not celebrate. It did not change shape suddenly. It simply continued. Because the decision did not create a new life. It confirmed the one that had already been built slowly, day by day, in silence, work, and trust. Outside, the wind moved through the trees the same way it always had. But inside the house, nothing felt temporary anymore. Not the table, not the stove, not the people sitting around it. And for the first time, waiting did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like stability finally choosing its own name.